Richard Wade at Ruralcrimes.com, and I'd like to welcome you all back to the YouTube channel where we interview key personalities who are researching and working on rural crime research, rural crime prevention and rural crime reduction. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Kreseda Smith. Dr. Smith directs Harper Adams Rural Resilience Research Group. She co-chairs the European Rural Criminology Working Group and advises internationally on how organised crimes, scams and modern slavery are impacting rural landscapes. She's appeared on BBC Countryfile, published extensively on the psychological toll of agricultural crime, and continues to push for policy change and holistic support for rural communities. So without further ado, I'd really like to welcome Dr. Kreseda Smith onto the screen. Kreseda, good morning and welcome to Ruralcrimes.com. And first, I want to start by saying a huge thank you. I'm really honoured to have you here today. How are you doing? And just for everyone out there, where are you today? What's happening in Dr. Kreseda Smith's world?
Well, morning, Richard. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you. So I'm actually working from the home office today, but you know, this is my usual place of work, just behind me. That's our main building of Harper Adams University. I've been there 20 years. And I think that, you know, rural crime is something that our students really need to understand, and that's a big part of what I'm trying to do at the university at the moment. You know, I'm doing the research, but I want to share that, of course, with the students so that they have a good understanding of, you know, the kind of things they may come across in their professional careers.
Yeah, and that research is fundamental. So it's critical, really, because you know you have people like myself and many others working with farmers, with landed estate owners, people working in those rural communities, and we see the impact that it has. But the reason I'm particularly over the moon that you've joined us today is you've got that deep understanding. You know, I'll see little bits here and little bits there, but you've actually spoken and researched extensively, so that you know the information and the data that you can provide is really, really critical for that wider understanding of your students, but I think the rural communities generally speaking. So if I may start with just a little dip into the research that you've done historically. What's your key research papers, and can you give us a quick flavour of the findings of those?
Absolutely. So the really important aspect of rural crime that I picked up on through my early PhD research some years ago was this impact it has on farmers' mental health and well-being. It wasn't something that I explored directly because I just didn't think I'd get the answers. It's not something you expect farmers generally to sort of open up about, but you know, when I was doing interviews and focus groups of farmers, this is something that was coming up time and time again. They were talking about not being able to sleep because they're listening for that noise in the farmyard. You know, how it makes them feel paranoid. You know, is there somebody watching what they're doing, where they're going, times that they're not on site, and all that kind of stuff. So that was really interesting. So of course I've done other stuff, but this kept coming back to me. So I did a piece of work specifically looking at how crime is directly affecting farmers' mental health, but also how crime interacts with some of the more well-known, understood stresses that farmers deal with. So, you know, your top three are finance, of course, the weather. I mean, we don't need to say anything about that. And paperwork, government bureaucracy. And actually, I wasn't sure how crime would sort of compare to these, because we all know that, you know, farmers are struggling. We know yields are down this year because of the dry weather. But actually, when I started talking to the farmers and asking them about their experiences, it was clear that crime was up there, and that there's a real issue in getting farmers to really address these problems, the impact that it has. And as I've already said, farmers are kind of, they don't talk about how they feel and their emotions and all that kind of stuff, but through the research, it was sadly quite depressing seeing some of the feedback that I was getting from the farmers, how awful they were feeling because they've been a victim of crime. I think a lot of the most shocking feedback I was getting was from farmers with livestock that have been the target of criminals, whether it's in-field slaughter or dog worrying, that kind of thing. It was those physical attacks on the animals that were affecting farmers the most, and to the point where there was suicidal ideation as a direct result of their animals being attacked, of themselves being threatened with violence by your criminals committing hare coursing offences, and we know where you live, we'll come back, we'll get your family, all that kind of stuff. So it's really hard reading sometimes.
I can imagine that, and you've hit on some great points there that I see during my day-to-day business. That is that fear of reprisal, the fear of repeat crime, which no doubt will crop up later, which is actually quite a common occurrence. But I won't talk because I know we've got your slides to go through shortly. But what we've found is that once the farmer or the rural business or even the rural community, not necessarily working in agriculture, have been victimized, the fear is heightened because you've been violated, you've been subjected to criminal activity, not necessarily with violence perpetrated during that act, but then at the back of your mind, as you said, are they coming back? Are they looking at me now? What's next? And it's just one of them many things that they've got to worry about. And this fact you've got your family there, you might have your wife or your kids or your mum. It's a horrific situation. It really is.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's not just the direct victimization, actually being a victim of crime, that creates that fear in these communities. It's indirect victimization as well, which is essentially your neighbours being a victim of crime. That makes you worry. Am I next? So it's not just that personal experience that's creating this fear of crime.
Fear of vulnerability within the community. It's a nightmare. What I'd like to do, Kreseda, if you don't mind, is I'm going to bring up your slides and then I'm going to hand over control to your good self. Let's bring those in. If you want to take us through the key points that you wanted to get across, I'll just sit in the background, and really the floor's open to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really interesting when I get the opportunity to talk about crime, how it's affecting farmers, rural communities more generally, and it's really great to see that there has been some acknowledgement at the government level that there is a problem here. I'm not going to talk about police funding because that's a whole minefield of its own. But of course, we now have the National Rural Crime Unit that are making great steps towards trying to do something to help our rural communities and the policing of these crimes. One thing that's always been a problem, and I know the National Rural Crime Unit have developed their own definition, which is kind of similar to what we have on this slide here, but it's like a two-tier definition, which is so those crimes that are affecting agriculture, the agricultural crimes, and then everything else. basically. And that's a great step forward. It's been far too long where we have no definition nationally of this issue. Different police forces are approaching the issue of rural crime in different ways. You've got some police forces sadly still not recognising that rural crime is distinct because of the factors of being rural has an impact on the kind of crimes, the way crimes are affecting the community. And that needs to change. And I'm hoping that Andy Huddleston and his team will, continue to build on what they've already started. In my own research, I've sort of developed this 3-tier definition of rural crime. And whilst I talk about rural crime, this sort of encompasses pretty much everything. But I do sort of try to be more specific as much as I can. So a lot of my research talks about agricultural crime. I work a lot with farmers, but I recognise, of course, that farmers aren't the only people that are victimised in the rural space. So the first tier, and this is not to say that one is any more important than another. It is literally just trying to identify how these crimes sit, how they affect the communities. And the first, of course, is the agricultural crime. This is the quintessential rural crime, if you like. Your tractor theft, things like hare coursing, the ATVs and the 4x4s, your working dog theft. This is far too little understood. And I know there's a great guy at Keele University that is championing the pet theft and including working dog theft. So it is becoming more sort of accepted and recognised, which is great. We all know about livestock worrying, of course, and certainly since COVID, this has shot up in its incidence rate. But really, those are the kinds of crimes that are directly affecting our farmers. I've added agro-chemical theft there because I think that's another offence that's too little understood. We know it's a problem. Certainly since the invasion of Ukraine and the sort of the trade blocks with Russia, getting hold of the base chemicals for our agrochemicals is harder. So it is the theft of these chemicals, but also the counterfeiting of these chemicals that is a continuing problem that doesn't necessarily get the sort of the exposure that it should. The next part of the definition of these crimes that are enabled by the nature of rural areas. So we know that domestic abuse and violence against women and girls happens anywhere. But just the mere fact of it happening in a rural space enhances the impact of that. You often get farmers or other rural community members who are involved in this rural domestic abuse. They're sort of pillars of the community. Nobody could even imagine that would be the case. So, where do the victims turn? Access to services is of course harder as well. Modern slavery is something that I've done some research on within the agricultural sector, and it's become a particular issue since Brexit. And I think it will continue to be an issue going forward, just because of the political discourse we have at the moment around immigration. It continues to be a political issue, but also, a labour issue and a problem for the farming sector more generally. So again, this is something that happens anywhere, but agriculture seems to have this little sort of problem within its environment. Poaching and wildlife crime, of course, again, you can poach hares anywhere or whatever it is, but again, it directly affects our rural communities. And the fields in our rural communities enable those offences to take place. We know a lot about the rise in GPS thefts recently, and again, it can happen anywhere, but those little units on top of our tractors are prime targets for criminals. There's an idea amongst the members of the Rural Resilience Research Group that there is potential that these GPS thefts are happening to order. It's organised. Where are they going? Potentially Russia. It is, we think, and again, we have no evidence. This is just conjecture and conversations that we've had with people in the area. Though if that GPS unit has the actual GPS part of it is sophisticated enough, it goes to Russia. They'll stick that on their drones, that's a whole other story. It would be interesting to see whether there is any evidence somewhere of that. That's something that we keep our eye on. Cybercrime, fuel thefts, ATM raids. That's an interesting one because people don't generally associate ATM raids with sort of rural crime, but where do they get the equipment to ram the ATMs? They're coming from farms. And so there's that inextricable link between your farms and these banks being hit. And then the third category is just crime in the rural space. This is basically everything else. Anything that can happen anywhere, but just happens to be in a village, on a farm, whatever it might be. So antisocial behaviour, speeding through villages, I know is a bugbear for a lot of the people that I talk to all the time. Burglaries, your home will still be burgled whether you're in a rural area or an urban area. And then you've got things like hate crime, food crime, food adulteration, fly tipping, I know is the worst of the worst at the moment. And then just other thefts of other items that could make the offender a little bit of money. It's all part and parcel of that sort of other crime in the rural space. So that's kind of how I work in terms of the research I do, and I find that it helps me to be able to explain what I'm really focusing on, what I'm talking about, how one particular crime might be different to another one. So that's kind of the approach I take to the research. And like I say, it's nice to see that the NRCU is doing something similar with their.
Yeah, what that slide brings home to me is the pure scale of it. It's huge and it's a massive issue, directly affecting the people themselves and their livelihoods ultimately. Absolutely. You get your GPS unit nicked, can't do your work, lose your gator, your tractor, your quad bike, or your dog. There's two things on there that I find particularly interesting, and a lot of people would probably go, "Oh God, fancy that being part of rural crime." One is the slavery aspect of it, and there's been cases, hasn't there, where there's been police raids, people living in the most horrendous conditions, like literally flea pit beds in shacks. It's horrific, and the violence and the intimidation that goes with that, absolutely horrific. And then the increase of the link between what appear to be diverse events and ATM theft directly linked to rural crime, because as you say, where did they get the tractor, the digger from, the JCB, and then it's probably helping to fund drugs, and it's all linked together. So that's a brilliant slide. That really sets the scene of what you're dealing with, and there's a lot of it in there.
There is absolutely. And I mean, we don't really know the scale of what's going on. Of course, we have the NFU Mutual report, which really does give an insight to all of this, but there are limitations to that data, and I kind of think it is absolutely the tip of the iceberg, because if you do a bit of maths, and a bit of guesswork, it kind of puts the NFU Mutual figures in the shade. I often talk about, again, this is my basic maths. I was never very good at maths, but basic maths, using data that we do know. There are 209,000 farm holdings. Now, I'm just focusing, of course, on farms. Rural communities will increase this, and crimes that affect them. But 209,000 farms across the UK. So that's England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. If you look at the NFU Mutual data, if you assume, and a lot of this, of course, is assumption, but if you assume that every one of those 209,000 farms have been a victim of crime once, that gives you an equivalent claim figure of about £250, which just doesn't make sense, because that's probably below their excess rate for a lot of farmers. So I did a little bit of guesswork and an assumption and basic maths. If you assume every one of those farms has been a victim of crime at least once, their average claim is £5,000, which still could be potentially quite on the low side. This is over £1 billion that is being taken out of farmers' profits, farmers' pockets. And like I say, this is just guesswork, but it just shows that huge gap that's happening. And of course, again, that's just working on the property offences. The acquisitive crime. This doesn't take into account crime against the people, domestic abuse, the actual broader impact of that crime on that person, which I'll talk about on the next slide. We talk about the economic impact of farm crime, of rural crime, but it's much, much bigger than that. This is a diagram that I've worked on and tinkered with over the last few years. So this is looking at the second and third order effects of the action of crime, victimisation. And this is something that has come from, the engineering, the military environment. So it has, a long history of use, but not in this context. So we're thinking about that immediate action, that victimisation, that offence that has affected farmers, rural community members, whomever it might be. That's the action. That's the first point. Then you've got the immediate response that that person might do. Ring the police, report it to the police. Start the painful process of an insurance claim, and it is painful, but necessary. So you've got that financial loss, You've got the time that it will take to replace the stolen items. You know, the prime target at this time of year are your tractors, your combines in the field, because that's where they are. Because the farmers are just super busy at harvest time. But if you try and get a replacement tractor from a contractor, you got no chance at this time of year. So it's a real problem in terms of the time it takes to address the immediate issues. But then you've got the sort of the short-term consequences. So this is, you know, 3-6 months after your victimisation, your crime event. And with farmers, as I've already mentioned, and I think a lot of your audience will recognise, farmers generally don't talk about their feelings. They don't talk about how that crime has affected them, unless somebody specifically asks, and then they might, you know, well, you know, I don't sleep very much, and you know, they'll sort of tiptoe into the subject almost. But if they don't speak to people, this has a real impact on their psychological well-being. You know, it does have a huge impact, as we've already talked about. You know, if these people do not get the help that is available to them, they leave the sector. That creates a problem in terms of, you know, the reduced number of farmers, food security, etc., etc. But it also means that there's a real effect on the farmer, the person, in doing their day-to-day job, managing their business, making business decisions. The research has clearly shown that making decisions under stress is not great, because you make poor decisions, you have poor decision-making ability. So, you know, there may be issues that would be sort of longer term in its effects, but then you've also got their ability to complete contracts that they're signed up to, you know, whether it's animals or crops. There's those issues, which again has a knock-on effect in terms of the profits of the farm. The effect that not dealing with the impact of the offence, the offence, also has an impact on how they perceive the police. Too many times I talk to farmers, and they say, farmers and rural community members as well, they say, you know, they didn't come back to me, they didn't come and see me, they didn't come and talk to me, I don't know what the outcome was of the crime report. And so that has an effect on how the victims are thinking about the police, how they think about, well, if it happens again, will I report it to the police? So there's a whole cycle of that confidence and trust that starts to be built onto. It's already there. We know it's already there. There's already, you know, reduced community confidence in the rural space, but this just sort of adds to it. And then you've got those longer terms. So this is, you know, 6, 9, 12 months down the line and beyond. The key thing for me is that lack of help seeking for the psychological distress can then have an impact on their physical well-being. So again, research has shown that there's a clear link between chronic stress and physical health issues. So heart conditions, stroke, they are directly related to increased levels of stress over a long period of time. So again, we've got that ongoing psychological distress that's now manifesting physically. And again, that has a knock-on effect on their ability to do their day-to-day job, to be able to work, 10, 12 hours every day. So it's a major issue in terms of business continuity. Again, there's the ongoing impact on decision making, and this worsens as your psychological well-being becomes more chronically affected. The issue of confidence in their own neighbours, trust in their neighbours, always sort of looking, out of the corner of their eye. Well, was it you? So that is a real problem. The police response, not just the police, because the police do the best that they can do with the resources available. I completely understand that. It's the sort of wider criminal justice system also affects how farmers feel about everything, how their crime has been dealt with. So, this will just, again, go on and will hugely affect the likelihood of crimes being reported to the police in the future. So there's a whole ongoing raft of multiplying issues that one single incident can create. And of course, if they're a repeat victim, then that just multiplies again. It just magnifies everything that we already know potentially happen. So it's really quite it's quite sober reading when you sort of look at something like this and think, as a non-farmer, but who's spent a lot of their time in the rural environment, growing up and knowing what village life is like. If you think that just one of those people that live in that village that you grew up in, or that one farmer that really well is struggling with this kind of stuff, on top of everything else that they're having to deal with, the weather, general finances, machinery breakdown, all those other stresses that they're having to deal with, you're like, well, how do you even keep going? Right. And it's very sobering when you.
It really is. And that, I love that graphic, and the reason I love that graphic is it tells the whole picture, because perhaps for people not involved heavily in rural crime may wrongly perceive someone nicks, let's say, a quad bike or a tractor or a GPS unit, so the farmer's insured. Excellent, let's go and get a new one. And what this says is, well, you got to think a lot wider than that. First of all, there might not be one available. Insurance premiums then probably going to go up anyway next year. But it's that compound effect of this and this, all adding together. And this business, this rural agriculture, farm, landed estate business, works with very tight schedules, weather-dependent deadlines, and other timelines. That waiting 3 weeks for a new whatever it might be could knock that all out, and that's just going to add to that stress and trauma. So that is a wonderful slide, and that tells the whole picture, not just someone's nicked my kit and I've got to wait for a new one. Much deeper than that. I think there's another slide as well on this one, Chris.
Yeah, kind of related. It sort of comes back to that idea of confidence. Of course, the police are their first point of contact when they've been a victim of crime. So, very often a lot of these conversations revolve around the response they get from the police. But, the slide after this kind of adds to that. It is the wider criminal justice system. And, it's clear when you talk to farmers that have been a victim of crime and the response they get, it's just not good enough for these rural communities. But hand in hand with that, they are fully cognizant of the fact that police forces just don't have the money to be able to throw what's really needed at rural policing. They've got 10 million other competing aspects that need funding as well, and some will be a higher priority politically sometimes, but some communities will have certain priorities that mean often rural crime is sort of further down the pecking order. And for me, I find that really frustrating, because there's a clear increase in the organized nature of crime in the rural space. Not anyone can go along and round up a flock of sheep in the night and have them away to somewhere. You have to have some kind of expertise, whether it's insider knowledge, somebody who works on a farm, or whether it's somebody who has worked on farms elsewhere and has taken this pathway. But it is organized without a doubt. If you want to steal sheep, you need to be able to round them up. So you go and steal a dog. You need some way of transporting the sheep. So you need a trailer of some description and something to pull the trailer. So they'll go and have a landy from another farm. Then you've got to have somewhere to take the sheep, whether that's a holding facility or an abattoir, an illegal abattoir, or an abattoir that's being opened by a ne'er-do-well that works there and can make a bit of extra money. And then obviously that meat has to go somewhere into the food chain somehow. And then of course you've got the issues of vet meds getting into the food chain and all the things that go with that. So the fact that a lot of forces don't engage between their rural crime teams where they exist and their organized crime units. I know there's higher priority organized criminality that needs to be dealt with, your county lines, your child sexual exploitation and all of that stuff. But it's often the offenders that are involved in that stuff that are also doing this as well. So getting the police sometimes to recognize that and to think outside the box is kind of difficult sometimes. And I think this figure is the foundations of trying to improve things. This is what we have at the moment. People aren't reporting crimes, possibly because they've had a bad experience in the past, possibly because their neighbour says, oh, don't bother because you won't get anywhere with the police. Who knows? But the farmers, rural communities don't seem to be reporting crimes. Often it's too hard to report a crime. You're hanging on the phone on 101 for 45 minutes, an hour. These are busy people. They haven't got that time to do that. So obviously, the police don't know these crimes are going on, and it's all about policing through intelligence. If they don't have that intelligence or that information from the communities to create the intelligence, they don't have the evidence to allocate the resources. So then obviously the communities don't see the police, and so the cycle continues.
Around it goes.
Absolutely. And we need some way of interrupting that cycle. I've come into the end of a project that's looking specifically at the factors that are affecting community confidence in the police. And, they say time and time again, just communication, visibility. These are the things they want. So they don't necessarily want police officers to be, walking the lanes, because they know that's just not workable. But just to see them at some time is really important to them. But without getting the buy-in of the higher ups in the police force, the police and crime commissioners, the local mayors, the people that hold the purse strings, it's really difficult to say how this cycle can be disrupted, but it needs to be. The government are talking about a neighbourhood policing guarantee that promises a minimum level of service, and if you don't get that minimum level of service, you can hold your force to account. Well, how can you have a minimum level of service that fits all of the communities within that force area? You know, you might say, well, you know, this is our minimum level of service, we'll respond within these amount of minutes, and you know, there'll be somebody on your door within 24 hours, etc. Well, that doesn't happen in rural communities already, so you know, how is this even going to work? And people in rural communities that I've spoken to are very pessimistic about this government approach. Everything in that information about the neighbourhood policing guarantee is focused on towns, high streets, stopping the shoplifting, which I recognise is a massive problem, but they're not thinking about rural communities, remote homes, you know, remote villages. You're never going to get a police officer to a remote village in the Highlands from the nearest town in 8 minutes.
It's not
going to happen. So who knows? I will keep on, you know, badgering and working with the police. I work with our local force area. There's a regional rural and wildlife crime group that I sit on. So we do what we can.
Keep banging the drum. You got to.
So being in the room is I think the first step, and you know, it is baby steps, but whatever I can do to help the police, the strategic decision makers within the police understand that this is something that needs addressing, I will continue to do that. Just my last slide, just very quickly. I've dropped these examples in because it really highlights that, you know, yes, okay, people often talk about the police being the issue, but actually I think the police do the best they can. It's also about enabling understanding in the wider criminal justice system. So I found 3 news reports. They're all about livestock theft and all the nastiness that goes with that. But I just want to highlight in each of these stories, just very quickly, what the sentence was. And I think that will really, for your listeners, for your networks, I think it will really highlight this lack of understanding of everything that I've already said, that impact that this crime has on the victims. So this first one in the top corner, man found guilty of stealing sheep and killing them in garage. This was actually quite local to me, and we were all talking about it. This guy was obviously arrested. It went to court, and when I heard judge for yourself. The sentence was a 12-month community order, 150 hours unpaid work, and a £150 fine.
Wow, deterrence.
Exactly. The middle one, the Daventry case, similar situation, £135 court cost, a victim's surcharge of £90, 80 hours unpaid work with a community order and £500 compensation.
Wow.
The Carmarthenshire story was a little more promising. So there was a 12-month prison sentence suspended for 24 months. 250 hours community service, and £5,600 compensation. Now that sounds like quite a lot of money, but there was more than 70 sheep stolen in that offence.
Yeah, exactly.
So it really highlights this just complete lack of understanding in the court system, as well as you know, the police. And I'll stop because that's a lot.
Well, that's, I think what that shows, that's been a fascinating little insight. We've got a couple more things to mention in a moment, but I think the real great thing that's come across, Kreseda, out of your chat and those slides that you've shared with us today, will get across the message of the depth of rural crime and the fact that it's much wider than things getting nicked. You know, there's policing, resourcing, there's mental health, there's organisation. I think you made a great point. Again, let's not be under any illusions that it's some fly-by-night popping in thinking, oh, I'll nick one of these. The logistics, as you quite rightly point out, the logistics behind stealing 50 sheep is huge. The logistics behind stealing quad bikes, tractors and GPS units and hiding them and stripping them down and removing tracking devices and then watching them appear either in Africa or the Ukraine or the UAE, wherever, within a couple of months. That requires organisation, chains of command and well-funded, badly intended, well thought out crime gangs organised. So that you brought home those points really, really clearly, and that's so important. What I want to mention here, so I know I want to give you an opportunity here, Kreseda, to tell us what's going on with the Douglas Bomford Trust, because I think people will be very interested in the work that's going on there.
Yeah, so this is a project that I've recently started, funded by the Douglas Bomford Trust, who are very much focused on helping improve the agricultural community across a whole range of aspects. What this project is really looking at is trying to understand how farmers are making decisions around their crime prevention choices to protect their agricultural assets. And that's everything from their tractors to their sheep to the tools that they use. And I've currently got a survey open. It's an online survey. And I'm encouraging any farmers, contractors as well, because of course they have significant asset lists that they have to protect, to just give me your thoughts. Give me your thoughts. It's mostly tick boxes on what you use in crime prevention methods, what you don't use, why you use those methods that you do, what is it that drives those decisions. All that kind of information will be super useful for me to do more research on this particular aspect.
Well, that's great. And then by default, once published, that helps the wider community as well. So the more people that can be involved in that, the better. So what I'll do, Kreseda, is when we finish, if I get hold of that, I will make sure that's whatever. Is it a QR code? I think it is.
There's a QR code or a link. So yeah, I can give you both of those.
Yeah, you give both of those to me. I'll make sure they sit prominently on page 1 of ruralcrimes.com and in the show notes that we put out on this, which will go onto YouTube and LinkedIn as well. So that would be great. Before we close, Kreseda, obviously a huge thank you. It's been fascinating and insightful, and you've raised some bits that don't normally get spoken about in the rural crime sphere. Generally speaking, we know it's an issue, but not a lot of people talk about it. So glad you brought in modern slavery. That's something that never gets mentioned in rural crime, and things like ATM raids and all that, and the interlink between organised rural criminality and those wider gangs, county lines, sexual exploitation. It's the same people predominantly doing these crimes, because obviously in the rural sector, the key factors that you've pointed out, the geographical location alone and the lack of sight of police, the chances of being caught in the act pretty damn slim. Makes it rich and right pickings. So, you know, high risk, limited, big reward, and low chance of getting caught. So, anything else to add, Kreseda, before I close my final?
I don't think so. I think it's really important that, you know, everybody, whether they're rural or not, actually understands the problem that rural crime presents to the UK and globally. You know, it has broader implications. You know, we're all thinking about food security at the moment. Well, if we haven't got our farmers, how is that even possible? So, you know, I'll always try to fight the corner of the farming community, the rural community, rural businesses, and help people to understand how this is really affecting them.
Well, thanks very much indeed. Kreseda, don't despair. I'm going to put you out of shot while I've just closed off, but please don't despair. I'll literally be a couple of seconds and I'm going to come straight back to you, and it won't be recording, but thank you. Really, really appreciate your time. So Kreseda's out of shot there. She's still sat on the green room, but my closing remarks are really to thank Dr. Kreseda Smith from Harper Adams University for sparing her time today to share with us what has been a really, really insightful talk. It's opened up areas that often don't get discussed when we talk about rural crime. And in closing, I just want to mention a couple of final points. It's a big issue, much, much bigger than you'll see written down on reports and published data. That's literally is the tip of the iceberg. And so if we accept the premise that it's a huge problem and that you, the farmer, the landowner, the rural community person, are going to be a victim unless you do something about it. So while the police are doing their bit, while all the rural crime groups are doing their bit, and while all these other things are going on, the criminals are watching you. And the research that I personally did, analysing rural crime between 2014 and 2024, stated a very, very clear picture. What they were doing in 2014, they're still doing today in 2025. My report went up to 24. So the method of operation of the criminal has got better. They use better technology. They use drone surveillance and covert surveillance operations, high-tech equipment. They're organised, they're funded, and they're looking at you. So while all of these things are going on, you need to take action. So if you live in a rural community, if you own a rural business, farm, or you work on a landed estate, it's your responsibility to protect your own assets. So I would urge you, while all of this other stuff is going on, take responsibility yourself. And if you do nothing else, stop. Have a look at your own property, your own premises, and your own business operations from the eyes of a criminal. How easy is it to get in? How easy is it to gain access to the things that we know they want to steal? And how quick can they get away? Put in barriers and defences along the way. It doesn't have to cost lots of money. But you need to do something. Waiting for the criminals to come along is not an option, because they will, and you'll suffer, as Dr. Kreseda Smith has quite rightly pointed out, potentially on a huge life-changing scale. So listen, thank you so much. One final favour to request: if you've enjoyed this chat, please do consider subscribing to the channel, click the alerts bell, and feel free to make some comments. And thank you very much indeed. See you again soon.